Hello, I'm Anthony. Today I want to try to share with you my love for musical inversions. I've just realised how weird that sounds. I'm as fascinated by the maths and the science of music as with the stuff that actually enters my ears. I find it incredible that the universe has come up with this unbelievably beautiful template to make sound. And it's really easy to take for granted how complex a simple chord can be. So I'm going to go through some examples today to hopefully kind of bring to your attention some of the stuff you might want to be thinking about when you're writing your song and you're playing chords. There are a lot more interesting things that you can do with a simple C major than that. If you enjoyed this video today, please check out my Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. It's an awesome way to help support my channel. First things first, let's have a quick refresher on the concept of intervals. In the chromatic scale, which is the basis of the vast majority of Western music, we have 12 intervals, exactly 12, no more, no less. And rather than me playing them badly, I've recorded them into Cubase. So here are the 12 musical intervals, starting with the minor second, fairly unpleasant that one, major second, minor third, major third, perfect fourth, diminished fifth, perfect fifth, minor sixth, major sixth, minor seventh, major seventh, and unison or octave. That's it. Those are the only intervals we've got to play with, and any song that anybody has ever written has always and only included combinations of those intervals. There's nothing else you can do tonally. Obviously, rhythm and non-tonal sounds are a different thing. But when we're talking about melody or harmony, this is it. This is our rule book. Not all these intervals are made equal. Some of them are far more important structurally than others, and there's really good maths behind why. We like listening to consonant sounds, and a consonant sound is described as one that has a simple ratio. The rules of the universe are really straightforward as far as the harmonic series is concerned. I've actually made a video purely on the concept of the harmonic series. I'll put a link to that above because that's a big and very scientific subject in its own right. But suffice to say that all of these notes have ratios between them. So the difference between a C and another C is 2:1. When I play those two notes, the upper C is exactly twice the frequency of the lower C. The next strongest relationship, because the next simplest ratio after 2:1 is 3:2, and that's a perfect fifth. From C up to G is a perfect fifth. That sounds great because it's a simple ratio. We as humans have some sort of affinity with simple maths, and we just like the way these things sound. These are absolutely basic building blocks of sound. The perfect fifth is so important, it actually defines all of the notes of the chromatic scale. You stack perfect fifths on top of each other in order to define every note of the musical scale. And there are compensations and kind of compromises that you have to make in order to squeeze all of the notes into the mathematical construct, but fundamentally it's based on that. So that's going to be a really important one. So what I want to do for you now is break down some of the relationships between the humble C major chord to find out how interesting is that. What kind of stuff can we do if we understand intervals and inversions, which is a side shoot of intervals? What can we do that's interesting with the C major chord to make it sound anything other than this? Well, this is the simplest thing that we can do. We can invert the order of the notes. So this first chord is C major in root position. So that's C, E, G, exactly as you'd play it on the keyboard. This is C major in first inversion. Can you tell? It sounds different. And this is C major in the second inversion. Again, it has a different kind of sound to it. It feels different. It sounds different. But they're all C, E, G. Just the order of the notes have been changed. All we've basically done is picked up the root note, thrown it above, and that's turned it into the first inversion. One note's been moved out of the way. Then we pick up the second note and we throw that up to the top. So two notes have now been moved out of the way. In other words, this is the second inversion. the order of the notes have been inverted. And this is where things start to get really interesting, because the reason why those three chords sound so different is because the ratios, the relationships between the different notes is different in each of those cases. Here's C major in root position. The gap between C and E is 4 semitones. From C to G is 7 semitones, and from E to G is 3 semitones. So you've got 3 different gaps between those notes. Don't forget, any note can be spanned across to any other. So C to G is a totally reasonable relationship to consider. Both of those notes are being played simultaneously. Don't just look at notes that are next to each other. Look at notes that are existing in the chord. So C and G have to be considered. That's a 7-note interval. And herein lies one of the bases upon which the C major chord is considered to be probably the most commonly played chord in all of musical history. The intervals between it are really strong. 7 is the perfect fifth, the strongest of all your interval relationships. C to E is a major third. I would argue the next most important relationship between notes. You can put an asterisk in that. We'll get into perfect fourths in a moment, but C to E is a major third and a hugely important interval. But in the same chord, we also have a minor interval from E to G. That's a minor interval, 3 semitones, and it has that slightly sad feeling. It adds a little bit of extra colour to the C major. So it's the strength of the mathematical relationships between those notes that define the strength of the C major chord, the reason why it's so stable, such an anchor for so many thousands of pieces of music, is because of these numbers. The 473 becomes like a DNA code that's defining the strength of the chord. Now what happens when we play EGC instead? We're still playing a C major chord, but because we've inverted that root note, we now have a different set of relationships. E to G, we're still getting a minor third. It's actually the same minor third interval that we had in our first chord. So that component of the chord has stayed the same and is going to sound identical in both cases. But from E to C is an 8-note interval. We haven't heard one of those before. That's a minor sixth. And it's a brand new type of sound. Every interval sounds different. So we now have this combination of notes that we didn't previously have, and so the chord is going to sound fundamentally different. Minor sixth is a beautiful chord. It's a consonant chord, so it still sounds strong. Obviously, we're dealing with a C major chord here. It's going to sound strong. But it has a different flavour, a completely different characteristic to the major third that we have if we drop that C down an octave, which is where we started with. We started with a major third, we inverted the C, and now we have a minor sixth. G to C is a 5-note interval, and that's called a perfect fourth. This is another really important interval, a very strong one, and it sounds extremely stable. If you think about it, there's a very good reason why the notes that are involved in that chord, G and C, are the same 2 notes that were involved in the perfect fifth earlier, which we'd already identified as the strongest of all intervals. So if you invert a perfect fifth, you create a perfect fourth. In fact, that's why those 2 intervals are called perfect, because they invert to another perfect interval. They're the only 2 intervals that are perfect, and it's exactly because of that reason. You start with the perfect fifth. Everything else revolves around that black hole at the center of the galaxy. And when you flip the C down, it's another perfect interval. It's still very strong, but this time it's called the perfect fourth. Anecdotally, the reason it's called a perfect fourth is because that 5-note interval starting from C, let's just kind of temporarily start from C instead and step up 5 semitones, we get to the 4th note of the scale. But that's not what's actually happening in our example. When we play a G and a C, it's the perfect fourth interval, but it's actually rooted on G. So our DNA code has now changed. We have a 385, still an extremely strong DNA code. 385, they're all good numbers. You're going to get a good strong chord out of them, but it's not 473. It has a different quality to it. Here's the second inversion. G to C, still the same perfect fourth that we had in the last example, but now we've got a new one, G to E. That's a major sixth, another consonant interval, and still very beautiful sounding, but not the minor third that we had earlier. So a minor third inverts to a major sixth. A major third inverts to a minor sixth. Majors always invert to minors. Minors always invert to majors. Perfect inverts to perfect. So we're building up this template, this kind of blueprint of interesting sounds. All of the intervals have their own unique characteristics, but in the same C major chord played three different ways, we have a completely different DNA blueprint. These code numbers define the characteristics of the chord, but they don't all sound the same. 473 does not sound like 594. Now, by the end of today, I want to have a look at all of the different intervals. So far we've seen 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, but there's obviously more to go. So the next example that I'm going to bring up introduces a new note into the C major chord. I'm going to add the major 7 note into the chord. So now we're going to be playing C major 7. I'll let it run through and we'll listen to the 4 different versions, the 4 different inversions of C major 7 chord. Root position, first inversion, second inversion, third inversion. We've now got 3 different notes that we can throw up to the top to effectively generate 4 different chords. And simply by adding 1 extra note, we're now playing with a 4-note, a really simple chord. C major 7 is a very simple chord, but look at how complex the DNA map's got. Each of these codes defines the flavour of that chord. Now, I'm not going to go through every single one of these intervals. I'll just pick out the ones that we haven't already seen yet. So in the basic C major 7, I'll play it an octave lower. Right, so that now maps up with Cubase. We have this B, and the difference between C and B is 11 semitones. That's really the crux of the C major 7. This B is desperate to get home. You have these kind of anchor points around which chords operate. The root is the most stable, the strongest bass camp, and a note very close to the root, basically adjacent in either direction, is going to be desperate to get back there. It wants to get home. So this B wants to resolve to the C. So it's straining there. You've got all of that tension, but it's lovely tension. Now, major 7 sounds pretty nice. The notes are so far apart, you can't really tell how kind of mathematically enharmonic they are. But what happens when we drop that B an octave and we put those 2 notes side by side? That's very dissonant. There's one example of an interval that's considered to be more dissonant than the minor second. We'll get there eventually. But that is pretty violent. Generally speaking, unless you're playing jazz, I suppose, or some complex avant-garde classical music, you don't play consecutive notes in a chord. It's very, very difficult to pull off because it sounds so dissonant. And yet when we separate them by 11 semitones, you've still got that tension, but it doesn't sound anywhere near as violent as the minor second. Now, some of these chords have minor seconds in them. You can see the single semitone intervals, all of these 3 successive chords. And when we were playing through them, you can really hear that tension. In root position, the chord sounds pretty pleasant. The other 3 are far tenser. So this is an example of the order of the inversions that you play. In other words, the arrangements of the intervals, your DNA map fundamentally define how that chord's going to sound. And there's no better example of the importance of intervals than the comparison of the 11 semitone interval from the 1 semitone interval, because they're so starkly different. No self-respecting musician for the past 300 years has been able to finish a concert without playing the dominant 7 chord down to the root. It sounds like this. Absolutely archetypical way to end a piece of music. The dominant 7 chord, in this case it's a G7, and that's what you're seeing, G, B, D, F. They're the notes of the G dominant 7th chord. They have a really interesting relationship, and it's all to do with the intervals, it's all to do with this DNA map. So let's pick out why. Why is the dominant 7th chord so important? So here we've got G, B, D, F, and you can see I've written out the DNA for it. Now some of these intervals we've already seen, but some we haven't. G to F, that's a minor 7, pretty dissonant. But the real kicker is B to F, because that is a tritone. Tritones invert to themselves, so if I bring that F down an octave, I'm still playing a tritone. It's the only chord that inverts to itself, and it's got a really bad rap. I mean, for hundreds of years this thing was called the devil's interval. You weren't allowed to play it in classical music because it sounds so dissonant. Now, you put that combination of notes in the hands of a Canadian rock band, I know it's played in a different key. I think it's played in, is it C? Tritone can be used to very great effect, but here we've got a tritone based on B. And it is really, really tense. The reason why the G7 chord works so well, the dominant 7th chord, is because of that tritone. It's also partially because we've got a 10 in there, which is also a dissonant interval, but it's all about generating this tension. This thing is absolutely desperate to get home. The B wants to get to C, the F wants to get to G, then we would have a perfect fifth and everyone would be happy. But that's not the case. We're not happy. We're tense and strained. And this is the fantastic paradox of the dominant 7 chord. It sounds so inoffensive, it sounds pleasant, and it really, 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 really wants to get home. But inside it, the DNA inside it is complex and angry and frustrated. We've got 6s and 10s in there, and we can throw the 10 away and generate a 2 instead. Another really quite unhappy sounding interval. So you can either have this unhappy interval, which is okay, you know, it's less angry, or this one, which is like really pretty going for it. So when we invert those two chords and we go from the 10 to the 2, we change the DNA slightly, we get that extra tension. Listen to those two chords again. They're both G7, both exactly the same chord, but really cranking up that tension, winding it to the maximum. So that angry storm with the tritone, the 6 semitone interval between F and B, and the major second interval between F and G, all of that stuff is so tense and angry that when it falls back, happy, 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 unisons and perfect fifths and major thirds, all of the heavy duty intervals. We've brought out the big guns for the final. We've got the unison, the perfect fifth, perfect fourth, the major third, the minor third. That's your full bag of all of the most important intervals. And then we've got a nice little minor sixth in here, which is a beautifully consonant interval. Add all of that stuff together. All I've done is thrown a second C on the top there, but simply by adding that second C, I've introduced a whole new bag of intervals that weren't there when I was only playing the 3-note version of the chord. So just adding a second note brings all of that extra colour and interest. Absolutely wonderful world. This is the good stuff. as far as I'm concerned. The ability to add one simple note, a unison bounce, and create all of this extra mathematical interest. That maths, your brain doesn't care about maths. We're emotional beings, we don't respond to music mathematically. But I'm fascinated by the fact that the universe is absolutely rigorously mathematical, and it just happens to accidentally be beautiful. I think that's a really wonderful thing. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you again. Thanks very much.